Good morning and welcome to the Fall 2019 Faith and Reason event. Yeah, that's right. This is one of our oldest and long-standing traditions. Been going on since the fall of 2005. So this is becoming a regular habit. I'm going to begin with some announcements and get that out of the way, and then we will start our more formal activities. Those of you that are freshmen need to pay special attention since you haven't done this before. The rest, maybe this is old hat. The times and locations of discussion groups will be located on the screens after the lecture. So I assume most of you know where you're supposed to be because you paid attention to your emails. But if you didn't, if you're not sure, the screens will have that information. If you're an off-campus student or faculty, and if you want to eat lunch, there are meal tickets available from David and Kiara. They will be at the back as you leave. If you're eating in the 12 p.m. group, please don't enter the dining commons until the doors are open. Because they'll be locked. So I guess that implies, please don't beat the doors down in your attempt to get to the food. After the panel at 12:30, or at 2:30 rather, the final session this afternoon, all students, not just freshmen, are requested to move immediately from this room to the front of Founders. There's going to be a big group picture. So please, you all look so nice. Get up there quickly for a picture. No stragglers. Got it? All right. Now let's begin with prayer. Father, thank you for your love for us. Thank you for the gift of faith and reason. And I pray that you'll be glorified by what is said this day. Give us minds to attend and sift. Help us to leave wiser than we came. In Jesus' name, amen. Our lecturer today is Dr. Doug Favelo. Dr. Favelo has been teaching history at PHC since 2010. I didn't realize it had been that long. He's deeply involved in the lives of his students. Those of you who have, I guess most of you have had him, all of you have had him for class. And he enjoys game nights with students. He's every year takes a group of students to either Rome or Greece. And I think one thing that is clear is that his love for history is infectious. I've been trying to get Dr. Favelo to do one of these Faith and Reason lectures for some years. And I can tell you I am excited to finally have him as our lecturer. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Favelo.
Thank you. We have a tall dean. Thank you so much. You're very kind. The classical Christian liberal arts have been described by some as a room around which are scattered many disciplines, music, sciences, literature, with Jesus Christ, who is good and true and beautiful, in the center. But imagine a different picture. Imagine a dance. And at this dance, in the middle is the one who is good and true and beautiful, Jesus. And around are dancing 9 young ladies. Urania, the muse of astronomy and the sciences. I picture her as sophisticated with some glasses on maybe. And Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, is a bit haughty. And Arato, the muse of lyric poetry, and Terpsichore, the muse of dancing. She's the most graceful. And then there's one, Cleo, the muse of history. Cleo, I picture her as maybe a bit shyer and wise beyond her years compared to the other ones. Cleo has a long list of suitors and admirers. The founding father Patrick Henry once declaimed, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging the future but by the past." Cicero dreamily fond, "Lady History is the witness of the ages, the light of the truth, the life of memory, the schoolmistress of life." Wow, that's Cicero. Miguel Cervantes agreed with almost a filial affection. It is the trait of historians to be accurate, truthful, and not at all overly passionate. Whatever. And neither interest nor fear, hatred nor fondness should make them turn from the path of truth, truth's mother, he describes as history, rival of time, storehouse of deeds, witness of the past, example and caution of the present, and warning for what is to come. But not everybody is so impressed with her. Henry Ford griped, "History is more or less bunk." To James Joyce, history was a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. And here's the entry for history in Ambrose Bierce's The Devil's Dictionary. History, an account mostly false, of events mostly unimportant, which are brought about by rulers mostly knaves and soldiers mostly fools. If you ask the average Joe on the street about the purpose of history, we all know what that answer is. If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. At the beginning of my career, when people would ask, "So what do you do?" and I would respond, "I'm a history teacher," they would invariably chime in with something like, "Yup, history is important. If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it." For a few years, I smiled and nodded because at least we history professors had some value. We were prophets who kept people from doom. But as the years went by, my response rang more and more hollow, more and more anemic. Is this really the whole point of history? Is it one big warning sign? This answer, it just seemed rather lifeless. So I started asking questions. What is the point of history? My answer is this Faith and Reason lecture. The first thing that bothered me about the philosophy is the source. Ironically, the most popular formulation of the answer to the question, why study history, what's the purpose of history, is not from a historian at all, but by the late 19th, early 20th century philosopher George Santayana, who famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Also, ironically, Santayana meant something different from how we use the phrase today. Average Joe says we study history so we don't fall off the same cliff as our predecessors. But the positivist, Santayana, casually said this almost optimistically. We Westerners are progressing beyond infantile barbarians, and he meant traditionalists who buy into religion, and move forward into an involved state. It should give us pause that a secular positivist philosopher like Santayana, with a worldview in many ways hostile to a biblical worldview, has coined a phrase that we've almost universally embraced. This doom-avoiding purpose to history, which in this essay I'm going to call low telos history, is simply assumed a priori by the general public. It is essentially proverbial wisdom now. But I submit that this low telos history is an uninspiring, mediocre, unheroic race to the bottom that is not terribly valuable for training souls. So much for the popular view. What about the educated elite who are supposed to study these things as part of the life of the mind and pass on that which is valuable to the rest of society? What is their philosophy of history? Well, to be fair, academia is a really big tent, right? But many master historians for centuries, from Germany, France, England to the US, have taken up the difficult topic of a philosophy of history. The list of people who have written on the subject is a who's who list of Western thinkers. But it is well documented that 21st century higher education statistically leans hard left and thus tends to eschew philosophies concerning stuff like absolutes, okay, the telos, sublime, merit. These reek of theism, traditionalism, and patriarchalism. But haven't conservatives fought this trend in history? Not really. Oh, sure, conservatives lament the forgetting or the worst discarding of heroes like George Washington. A few sparse voices bewail a book like Howard Zinn's Pulitzer Prize winning A People's History of the United States, which tried to tell the history of the U.S. without Washingtons and Jeffersons and Adamses. But where's the battle? We're pretty good, and rightly so, about being mad at abortion and mad at aberration in marriage and even the proper name of Christmas trees. But surely there's room for this. But in fact, conservatives have jumped on the pragmatic history bandwagon themselves. So how should we Christians think about history? It's a tough question. Since the Bible does not overtly spell out a philosophy of history. In fact, it is here that I have a confession. The more I've studied this, and I've been writing this for 2 years, the more daunting the task seems. A philosophy of history is in some sense a philosophy of just about everything. The topic is too big. First, there's a linguistic element here. What do we mean by the word history? History teaches us X about event Y. Okay, this would appear to be the traditional use of the word. History is so hard, said by students on the way to my final exam. Those two have history, said by PhD students in a bad college romance. And what about the cultural-linguistic differences between the English history, the French l'histoire, and the German Geschichte? Second, there are underlying epistemological and ontological debates here. We say something happened, but all the observers have differing viewpoints of what happened. Well, what if there are no observers? Does that impact the happenness of the event? That really is a word that philosophers of history use, happenness. Third, just to confuse us even further, there are scientific questions here. Time is often expressed mathematically, right, delta t. So do the scientists have something to offer to the question of the philosophy of history? Are all these events somehow able to be quantified mathematically, as was said in the 19th century, so we can make scientific predictions about human events? The theologians have not been silent on the debate either. We speak of God's sovereignty over history and his overarching purposes in history. Does that mean he is literally making all events transpire a certain way? What is the role of free will? After studying the grand debate, I have decided to punt. I'm not going to attempt a total Christian philosophy of history. Instead, I want to focus specifically on the question of just the purpose. I'm talking about attitude in a lot of ways, attitude towards history. One thing that distinguishes the Christian from the non-Christian is the idea that we all we do have purpose, a chief end of man, to glorify the Lord. This should include our historiography, what we write about history. For too long, we've settled for a view of history that does not reflect, I think, a biblical worldview. Sadly, Christians tend to think about history in a low telos way, like everybody else. Why? We don't do this in any other field. Rather, we focus on the sublime and only briefly study the common and the aberrant. To understand the good, the true, and beautiful in music app, do we focus most of our energy on John Cage's 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence? Or Schoenberg's cacophony? No. We listen to the best. We listen to Mozart and Bach. We don't dwell on E.E. Cummings' Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town in lit class with its almost repetitive gibberish. Or William Carlos Williams' anemic The Red Wheelbarrow, which I show in Western Civ, right? You know, the white chicken in the rain. No, we read the exceptional, the Shakespeare's and Dante's. T.S. Eliot said, Shakespeare and Dante divide the world. There is no third. And he's right. We do not look at postmodern trash like the twisted red shards of metal in D.C. for our ideas of beauty. We look at Michelangelo's and Raphael. We've settled for a low telos to our own loss. Instead of shooting for the stars, history is now this race to the bottom. It acts as a kind of negative stimulus, and while it perhaps offers a bit of communal protection, it is incapable of drawing people to live a noble life as we do it. This low telos philosophy of history has led, and will continue to lead at very best, to, I think, to an obsolescence of history, which I think we've already seen signs of this, and at worst to someone finally succeeding in harnessing the power of historical narrative for greater ill than we've seen. You know, that might sound like the plan of a diabolical supervillain in one of these Marvel movies, but we've already had some historical close calls, so to speak, with the fascists and communists of the 30s and 40s of the last century, who found great political and military power via control of the historical narrative. By my title's Metaphorically Reborn, I'm calling for return to higher purpose, a high telos for history. This high telos paradigm of historiography encouraged historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, and their readers toward a kind of holy discontent. High telos history is a valuable paradigm for spurring the citizenry of a free republic toward virtue, and not so incidentally fits perfectly with the biblical worldview. Whereas low telos history simply sets a very low and selfish bar for living, a high telos empowers men and women to better fulfill their God-given vocations. I began my research by examining our ancient thinkers on history to see if there's a better way. I believe it is the Greeks who best articulated and lived this, though early Christian thinkers came along later and properly directed them and set them straight. Much of Greek philosophy, indeed Greek culture, revolved around a rightly perceived need for something better. I love this about the Greeks. Something more beautiful, something truer than the world around them. They were obsessed with the pursuit of the good life, itself a shadow of the excellent, the sublime. The Greek agoge, the liberal education, sought to make free men who embrace the life of the mind and whose lives are bent toward nobler things. In spite of some difficulties, the Greeks eventually realized that the discipline of inquiry, that's what historia means in Greek, just investigation, was an important part of the pursuit of virtue. Now, perhaps surprisingly, the discipline of history bothered the Greeks. Aristotle ranked philosophy and poetry, by the way, over history because philosophy dealt with essences, the unchangeable perfect, which was knowable and trustworthy, whereas history was imperfect and transient. Humans frequently go against, deny, and or destroy what they know is good and true and beautiful. Thus, the philosophers looked down their noses, not ours here, I hope, on the historian who had to apply his art hemming and hawing about the numerous exceptions and caveats he had to make. But while investigation of propositions, truths, and forms is essential, the large corpus of data that we know as reality could not be avoided. History is the gigantic fact. The finality of history, even with all its questions, that it simply was there and that it impacted you whether you liked it or not. All of these factors birthed the discipline of history roughly contemporaneously with philosophy in the 6th century BC. The study of history was an attempt to understand what happened, and more importantly, to explain why those things happened, but not just to see errors that lead to pain and avoid them. The Greeks wanted to live better, live excellently. Let's look at some examples. Herodotus opens his book, his inquiries, thus: "This is the demonstration of the investigation of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that the things done by men may not become extinct with time, and that the monumental and marvelous deeds displayed by both Greeks and barbarians may not become forgotten, including, among other things, the reason why they went to war with each other." It is readily apparent that this is not low telos history. We see nothing here about the need to study the Persian War so we don't get into trouble, we don't get into future wars. Plato said peace is the apostrophe between wars. No, the goal of history is to avoid ingloriousness and forgottenness, if I may fabricate words from the Greek. Herodotus uses words like megala, monumental, and thaumasta, marvelous. Unpopular words these days, or at least they aren't used often in relation to virtue, which is another word no one wants to talk about today either. The Greeks well understood man's desire to have impact, right? I tell every Western Civ student that the great questions in life: why am I here? What's going to happen? And do I have value? Impact is just another way of saying value in the universe. Hence Herodotus' purpose: to provide an explanation of important events, not just for knowing, but so that we might live well. We temper this in that we know that all the Greeks had this unchristian just obsession with glory, with kleos, as their sham version of immortality. We know that was mistaken. But with that caveat, we can see that Herodotus wanted his inquiry to teach men to live high, live up to a lofty standard. What about Thucydides? The greatest of historians, in my opinion, writes, Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote about the war of the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, how they made war on each other, beginning from its first outbreak, and hoping that it would be both a great war and more worthy of the retelling of its glory than those that preceded it. For this was the greatest movement among either the Greeks or any part of the barbarian world, one could almost say, of all mankind. Thucydides' high telos view is plain. His prose must convey the gravity of such a war that saw so many dead men and the upheaval of states. Notice his diction, like axiologotaton, most worthy of recounting, implying that most of the time things really aren't worth making mention of. Or greatest movement, kinesis, movement, implies this almost titan shaking of the world's order. And note the superlative megiste. Elsewhere, Thucydides says that his history is not for the applause of an hour, but for all times. He looks back to the previous events and deeds of both the Greek and the barbarian world and finds them wanting. He says they were not great. Of course, there's a heavy dose of Greek hyper-competitiveness here in Thucydides, that Greek individualistic obsession with making everybody else look worse. We know this falls short in so many ways, right? We think of verses like the last shall be first. But it also points toward the Greeks' greatest strength. They have a keen sense of something better, an inherent antipathy, an antipathy toward the mediocre, toward settling. Thucydides operates under an important assumption. Remembrance leads to emulation. Let us continue on examining the historiographical philosophy of the brilliant Polybius, the great Greek historian who treats the Roman Republican world. He says, if the praise of history had been passed over by those who formerly chronicled past deeds, it would have been equally necessary for me to urge everybody to take up and study memorials such as this one, since there is no more ready corrective than the knowledge of past deeds. But since not just some out of the bunch, but all historians, so to speak, make this the beginning and the end of their labor, right, Telos? They say that the truest education and training for a life of active citizenry is the study of history, and that the most visible, indeed the only teacher of how to be able to endure the vicissitudes of fortune true to one's birth is the remembrance of the calamities of others. Now hold on, Dr. Favelo, the calamities of others. At first blush, this would appear to be worse than low telos history. This is that German Schadenfreude, that sick, secret obsession when something horrible happens to your roommate. Oh, your paper got deleted, I'm so sorry. Then you run and delete your own, or back up your own paper and kind of have this sickly, you horrible people. But this is not the focus of Polybius' exhortation. Ancient historians had always found wisdom in avoiding the mistakes of others, of course, but they don't obsess over it like we do. Look closely at the passage. We see that it is laden with a call to excellence. He doesn't just say bear up, but bear up and act genaios, nobly, like your birth. One time my bride said, one of our kids was whining. She's like, hey, bear up, you're a Favelo. This work is a call to historical arms, we might say, to act nobly. He wants his reader to read the history of Rome and be urged and corrected. I'm using his own words there. Toward being a better citizen, and the word citizenship is all throughout Polybius. He condemns the reader who would not be incited toward living better. Indeed, and we classical historians are always shrilly screaming this stuff and no one cares. Polybius clearly believes that the best teacher of character is the history of great people. The Greeks have their eyes upward. Yes, typically upward at their Greek peers, perhaps so they can see how to get ahead of them. But we know that this is a distortion of a truth. Our eyes and hearts need to be pointed upward toward the one who is good, true, and beautiful. The general Greek principle of history is a very good one. Put before our eyes and hearts examples of how to live rightly all the time, live and breathe it, and eventually a people will strive to live the same way. Who were the heroes on their walls, right? Not Taylor Swift. Real people who, well, she's a real person, but I'm sorry if you're watching this, Taylor. Real people who chose not to settle for the path of least resistance in life. People like Leonidas and Pericles, people whom they had met, had seen fight the good fight, and people they had seen die for that fight, right? Leonidas. Rome. Roman historians had the same desire to present excellence too. The paragon for our purposes here is the historian Cato the Elder, that moralizing curmudgeon. Sadly, his history, the very first history ever written in Latin, is only fragmentary. But we have enough of it to see that he has a communal view of excellence, a little bit different from the Greeks. So much so that he eschews proper names of individual commanders. Hannibal is only known as the Carthaginian general. and Scipio is his Roman foil. Cato does name lesser-known Roman men who gave their lives for their republic. Anybody who died, yeah, he gets his name in there. And that sacrifice makes them worthy of emulation. We might say that his history teaches us that the Roman Republican man in history is a type. It's a historical figure to which we should aspire, not some real Pericles or Leonidas. Livy, who used Cato and others, likewise presents the ideal Roman Republican man. Sacrifice for the state is the ideal of virtus, that Roman conception of high character. He has no problem with naming individuals, but he also is willing to use embellished source material. He just makes stuff up for a noble read. In his proem, he says that while his ancient sources may make stuff up, they get a free pass because they are ancient. We have this wonderful apocryphal story that the young future emperor Claudius came upon Livy and another historian, Gaius Asinius Pollio, arguing over who is the better historian, and they ask him to be the judge. After some thought, the precocious youth replies, "If I want the facts, I read Pollio. If I want to read a good story, I read Livy." Livy nods in approval. Good job. But in my opinion, the Romans' high telos is a shadow of its former self. Roman historiography is so interested in good character lessons that most Roman historians have no problem fudging facts if it makes a grander subject. Once history stops insisting on veracity and stops being about attainable, real, excellent people or excellent things they had done at the very least, it becomes hollow. The Romans were utterly pragmatic, and since the goal is the perpetuation of state power, which we'll see again later, then we should not be surprised when they always put their best foot forward, even if that foot had been photoshopped. I'm not arguing that this caused the end of the Republic. That was a long, difficult process, but I think it helped. History and virtue through history became impractical and unbelievable. No one was willing to risk a fight for representative government. One of the last Romans, who might have been a historical example of moral courage, is Cato the Younger, the last guy who does fight Caesar. But everybody quipped he was too righteous to have any friends. He himself was almost a kind of god. He was now an unattainable relic of a bygone era. What we're left with is Augustus. After the Romans sold their freedom for safety under the emperors, nobody could have a hero anyways. How can anyone have a hero that might threaten a god on earth? The only real historian among the Romans for the next 300 years, in my opinion, is Tacitus, but he can only use his talent to criticize any murderous Caesar once that guy's dead. You kind of get a free pass sort of thing. He has no living heroes upon which to draw, just the faded vision of the Republican man. He is sometimes seen as the historian of decay, which I guess makes high telos history really hard. He still dreamed of heroes, but cynically assumed they would never return. But for the average Roman in the empire, heroes were quaint legends who no longer inspired them enough to risk a fight. The new emperor Tiberius, under whom the truly great hero, Jesus Christ, was executed and rose again, Tiberius quipped before the now lap puppy Roman Senate, "How ready you are to be my slaves." High telos history requires what the New Testament calls that parousia, the boldness and confidence in one's identity and in your calling, in your mission to speak the truth regardless of the consequences. This was in short supply in the Roman Empire. To be sure, facts were still important. The secular Hellenistic world of the empire was verging on a kind of empiricism up to about Constantine. In the 2nd century AD, lo and behold, Lucian, a Greek, gives us the first treatise ever specifically on a philosophy of history, How History Ought to Be Written, its title. He's probably the first literary critic to spell out rather bluntly some rules about this. He says, quote, "Let the historian turn his brain into a mirror." Okay, all you freshmen are thinking about, how do I do this, right? Turn his brain into a mirror, unclouded and shiny and highly accurate, and whatever shape he has received the report of his subject matter, let him present it just so, neither twisted or discolored or variable, for historians are not writing fancy college essays. End quote. But thoughts of emulating the sublime were out of vogue, to say the least. While the methodology may have been right, the telos was not there. Lucian had no illusions that history would somehow restore the glory days of the polis. The only quasi-historic high telos work in the Roman Empire is not even history per se, and it's not even Roman. It's Greek, and his biography, namely Plutarch's Lives. We'll see that work later. For the time, it was a popular, quaint read. It's kind of like, isn't that cute? By the way, it is no coincidence at this very moment in history, right around 150 AD, that we see the rise of the trashy novel. Secular escapism was now king in the Roman Empire. That's what sold. In late antiquity, moving on through late antiquity and then to the medieval period, we get a muddied picture of the discipline because the Greek essence of Western historiography had disappeared. No doubt there were a few good historians like Ammianus Marcellinus, Bede, and Gregory of Tours, but these are the exceptions. For the most part, history had become no longer investigative and properly critical of source material and motives. It became almost this Eastern style of analytic record keeping, along with hagiography, the unhistorical storytelling and panegyric of the saints. Undoubtedly, such heroes as Ignatius, Polycarp, and Antony. You're not going to get through a faith and reason lecture without a desert monk, right, with Favelo. And Anthony of the Desert did inspire many men and women to live and die, right, horrible deaths for Jesus Christ. But while some, if not many of these stories are accurate, or at least in part accurate, these are not histories. These hagiographies painted saints who were just too transcendent, too unattainable, and not really a part of the community that the readers could identify with. The telos of these hagiographies, I think, was neither high nor low. It was just contempt and escape from the world. Though the escapism of late antiquity and the medieval period downplayed individuals, high telos in historiography experienced a bit of resurgence during the 15th century Italian Renaissance. Primarily because citizens of free republics were once again reading about larger-than-life Greeks and Romans, and they're willing to risk a fight for the republic, for Florence or Bologna. This new ethos for the Renaissance hungered for living examples of virtue in history. Starting with Petrarch and spreading through Florence and beyond, Renaissance men and women again embraced a desire for living examples of virtue. For excellence and merit with the discovery of classical literature. They had it in their hands again. They had their Greek historians and the Roman historians. They read Plutarch, Livy, Cicero, and others voraciously. Sadly, and I don't know why this is, we get no truly great historians from the area. It's kind of a mystery. Given the era's brilliant scholars like Erasmus, Martin Luther, and Lorenzo de Valla, or the fact that the Renaissance falls on the heels, in my opinion, of the world's greatest genius, Dante Alighieri. Perhaps they were a victim of their own infatuation with the past. They could never match the great classical masters, or the supposed greatness of those days, so why even try? Moving forward in history, it is well established that the religious battles, both real and metaphorical, of the Reformation were a kind of impetus for the intellectual changes of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. This is pretty well established. And we see these writings, people like Jean Locke and Pierre Bayle. A new emphasis on individualism provided fertile ground for thinking about heroes and excellence through history. It was a time when throwing off monarchies and reinventing the democracy required a great deal of heroic examples from ages past. And that's exactly the history in which these men and women were steeped. Once the delight of the Italians alone, by 1700, after the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, Plutarch was one of the most read pieces of literature in the West. Pericles, Alexander, and Aristides the Just were once again real models of virtue. Livy's stories of Brutus, the Horatii, and Horatius at the Bridge became standard educational fare. The founding fathers found courage to throw off the British yoke in the stories of the tyrannicides Harmodius and Aristogeiton. My goodness, Jefferson named his horse Arcturus, right? I mean, this stuff gets in you. Alternatively, when it was their turn to rule in the Great Experiment, there was no shortage of good anti-hero examples in slimeballs like Nero and Caligula. Hamilton was asked, are there any threats to the Republic? And he said, if there is a Caesar in the Republic, 'tis Burr. There's this other great story at Philadelphia debating what kind of constitution we're going to have, what kind of republic, what should our government look like, and they're having this debate in this muggy room, and someone gets up, I don't know who, and says, I think the new American republic should be like the Aetolian League of 220 BC. And all the founding fathers kind of look at each other, and someone calls for a recess, and they all go back to their hotel rooms and study up on the Aetolian League and come back and debate the merits of that for the republic. And yet, for all this positive, seemingly high telos philosophy of history, the Enlightenment was still the Enlightenment. What do I mean by that? Its anthropocentric, secular humanist colors shone through even in its historiography. Reason was king because reason supposedly was not fallen and lets you control the universe. But history by itself seemed too malleable, too metaphysical for the philosophe, that enlightened humanist. Unlike a science experiment in a beaker, history wasn't nicely repeatable and observable, and its good presentation required a kind of imagination that was too dangerous and akin to religious fanaticism for the skeptic. The past was tough to reckon with. Except for a few bright spots in Greece and Rome, it appeared to be a nonstop account of unreasoning brutes killing each other. Condorcet, who ironically died in a French Revolution prison, held that history had outlived its usefulness. Thus, the French philosophers came to an incorrect conclusion. It's okay to alter the past in order to improve society now. Pragmatism crept into history. Some, like Rousseau, thought one could force the facts to make history useful. Another example, constrained by this worldview, Voltaire somehow got into his mind that the Chinese and American Indians were actually deists and philosophers. This kind of abuse flies in the face of high telos history, which demands a humble adherence to the reality of facts, even if it seems disadvantageous. If the Enlightenment of the 18th century saw the weakening of a high telos of history, the beginning of the end, I would say, the world-changing philosophies of the 19th century cut the legs out from under her and paved the way for where we are today. This is ironic, since historiography reached its pinnacle at this time. The 19th century, historians were famous, rich people. We need to get back there. At no other time in history were historians so valued and respected. History was very powerful, as Karl Marx full well knew. We can identify at least 3 key moments in 19th century history that led to the death of high telos history. First, at the beginning of the century, there is this kind of nationalist romanticizing about history that, while eminently readable, admittedly plays with the facts. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his essay, The Use and Abuse of History, he warns, rightly so, he says, with the right nationalist romanticized history, you can do anything and kill anyone with it. In this respect, it reflects a return to the flaws of Roman historiography. The Romanticists, they didn't like the Enlightenment's rigid worship of reason, right? We know that, and the scientific method. But they didn't necessarily reject the philosophers' willingness to manipulate the facts. In fact, Romanticists in historiography were perfectly willing to tweak the facts in order to highlight the nobility of the subject, typically, someone of the state or some general or something like this. This is the age of great poems and war novels, like Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade and Tolstoy's War and Peace. These pieces themselves, those 2 I mentioned, are not chief offenders, but they capture the truthiness of historiography in the era. Note that this romanticism, it arose, hand in hand with nationalism, which requires this malleability of the facts, since history had to serve the state. Then came the earthquake that is Karl Marx and his Marxism. Nobody could have foreseen the work to which Marx, drawing on Hegel, would put history. This was bigger than anything the Greeks, the Romans, or Renaissance thinkers had envisioned. To Marx, history was moving inevitably, he would say scientifically, toward the big one, right? The revolution that would eliminate private property and eliminate all states. The first line of the Communist Manifesto reads, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles," end quote. Now, he was too much of an honest academic to tolerate simply changing the facts like his predecessors to advance communism, but his followers weren't as scrupulous. So they did bad history, reinterpreting the historical facts to find communistic society throughout the past. I'm just fascinated by Soviet historians in the 20th century. Just whenever they looked at Sparta, all they could see was Soviet Russia. Sparta was the proto-Russia. Another example, guys like Lenin and Stalin don't even consider things such as scruples, right? To them, history was just a tool to maintain totalitarian control. So they made Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky both famous Soviet artists, even though both of them died way before the October Revolution. Or when they needed to purge someone out of the state, they purged them out of history with a damnatio memoriae, just made them disappear. There's a third 19th century philosophy that attacked the idea of high telos in history, and that is positivism. So here's some background. The 19th century saw a general increase of knowledge that far surpassed any previous era. Linguistics, classics, archaeology, literary criticism, the hard sciences. There's so many developments in these fields, all contributed to so much being available to be known. The second half of the century, the fin de siècle, was a time of hyper-confidence, secularism, and triumphalism. Auguste Comte's philosophy of positivism, though it's hard to define, holds that we can only know what is observable from the so-called positive data, scientifically derived data, and also math and logic. He died just before Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, but its popularity fueled a growing adherence to positivism. Man now had an arrogant, secular, humanist confidence that he and his intellect owed nothing to God. History is just another science. Get enough data, any human being thinking rationally could come up with a perfect historical and I'd say scientific solution. And we could do it in this kind of sterile scientific environment. But this is a different kind of assault on high telos, as it is an assault on heaven itself. First, humans are not volitionless microbes to be studied in a test tube, right? They're mind, body, soul entities, and their history has value because they have value. Second, here's the end of grace and humility in the practice of history. Positivist history reeks of a hubris that's got to be offensive to God. Positivism's foundational assumptions could never lead to high telos history. So I think in the greatest age of the creation of isms, the 19th century, history was the primary battleground, and high telos history was the casualty. Never had history been harnessed and abused as it had been in this era. For the classical liberals, it showed a progression toward freedom. A bit later, the Darwinists could see in it evolution, scientific and unavoidable, toward higher complexity. To Marxists, history was the rails on which the inevitable great revolution would ride, when the worker would rise up and lose only his chains. If we have time in the Q&A, I'd love to talk about something I've been thinking about for a long time, how Marxist revolutionary states, even 70, 80 years after the revolution, have frozen time because it's a powerful tool for murder. The nationalists found in history a weapon to advance the state. But they all have one thing in common. History became an eschatological tool. Heaven might be the triumph of man apart from God, or the triumph of a powerful state, or the triumph of liberal democracy, or the triumph of the proletariat. But these are all the wrong heavens anyway. They ignore the requirement of true history, of high telos history, of humility, graciousness, and dedication to the truth. Thus came the end of noble history. If history serves some human end, as happened in the 19th century, and not the chief end of man, it will fail. But, you say, what of the 20th century and its popularization and acceptance of moral relativism? Isn't that the death of history right there, right? This is what conservative commentators are always, ripping apart. Rightly so. The 20th century certainly deserves some consideration. In my opinion, it's not the cause of it all, even though the moral relativism and academia of the 1960s are these favorite targets of culture commentators. But high telos history did receive its coup de grace in this period. First, if there is no such thing as truth, and if we define truth as correspondence with reality, including past reality, then there is in essence no history at all. which, by the way, leads to a very famous article called The End of History, or book, I should say, that about politics, which is an interesting connection. Maybe we can take that up in Q&A. This moral relativism certainly precludes my definition of Telos history. The historian Paul Conkin writes, "We cannot make events, whether of history or of any other sort, yield values. We may place a valuation on them. They themselves are simply there. The past itself does not really vote for either Brutus or Caesar, Protestants or Catholics, Whigs or Tories. The great realization was bound to come, and when it did come, the prevailing conception of history was bound to change." And what's so frustrating is he says this with a kind of glee. Value is dead in history. And that is the anthem that is raised across academia today. I've heard it. But my problem is, if we can't ask and answer the question of the rightness of Brutus or Caesar, or the rightness of Churchill versus Stalin, how then shall we live? As always, we do this with humility, knowing that we are no better than anyone, right? And but for the grace of God, we would make the same mistakes. Second, the 20th century's hyper-pluralism destroyed common context and even community in history. Coupled with a lack of a shared assumption of right and wrong, how do we tell a story that is in any way unifying? People find identity and value in a shared history, but nobody can find commonality with, let alone organize intellectually and evaluate 1,000 sub-narratives. And may I add, it's impossible to do, and we hate pragmatism, but how do you even have an infinite number of narratives studied on a college campus? You only have X amount of resources, right? You have to make some decisions about what is more important, more valuable. No wonder that history's reputation among the general public has taken a beating. Most people really don't like the idea of studying history because it was never shown to impact their lives. And I would say to show that a tool to show that they have value. If perhaps they got a glimmer of good history, the only reason they were ever given to study it was so they wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past, which is not all that attractive. We're not part of some grand story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We're just reading warning signs. But what's so ironic is that history movies and occasionally books do so well in the marketplace, right? Think of the movies that have sold so well. Gladiator, right? Saving Private Ryan. Why is it that history movies do so well if history's just dead? It's not just because of amazing cinematography and computer CGI stuff, okay? No, it goes back to those fundamental questions of life, which great literature and great art tries to tackle. Why am I here? Do I matter? Right? Those questions. What's going to happen to me? A meaningless story is no story at all. On the contrary, people watch history movies because first, they long for good, true, and beautiful things. And second, they want to see examples of these in other people's lives in the hope that somehow these things will correspond in some way to their own lives. There's this universal commonality in watching love stories, right? Everybody likes to watch love stories. Or stories of great bravery and sacrifice. There's a timelessness that is almost ahistorical, since they have happened, do happen, and will continue to happen. And this breeds an interconnectedness among people. Everybody walks out of that, Saving Private Ryan, hoorah, let's go fight the bad guys, fight the Germans, right? There's an interconnectedness, and I might say a confidence in something eternal. We walk out of those movies saying, bad is bad, right is right, we need to fight the good fight. Even if we know that it's not always that way, we know it should be. There's something inside of us that says it's the way it should be. It's the upside down kingdom of Christianity, the already but not yet of history that Christianity and Christians alone can interpret. People watch movies about World War II and they see that it impacts them, but also that contrary to the world's modus operandi, brave men and women strove and sometimes died for something great, and we might say excellent. We love a story with clear good and evil, and when people take risks for the good. That is relevance. People love that kind of stuff, as opposed to their history teachers telling them that history is just a systematic record of potholes to avoid. How depressing is that? So again, what made it all change? Why do we look down through history? I think concerned only with the snares in front of us, instead of striving to put hinds feet on high places. Early troubles brewed in the 18th century Enlightenment, yes, but I think it was the 19th century that really killed high telos history. I submit that it was the rise of romanticized nationalism, positivism, Marxism, and a general death of the idea of a real sublime to which we can aspire that signaled the beginning of the end. When we come to the 1960s and beyond, virtue in history becomes really problematic, and merit and ideas like this. The rise of postmodernism and the death of absolutes was simply the nail in the coffin. The death of high examples in history, even of the concept of the sublime in general, confirmed a slow process of reductionism in the Western mind. Santayana's words have become accepted truth, and we're content in its drab mediocrity. I propose that we as a culture, or at the very least as a school, would do well to reject this low threshold and start learning and teaching history with a high purpose in mind. This is very important. Not for our own self-aggrandizement. Never, 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 never that. We do it because we want to be our best for Christ. I wish to end by returning to my metaphor of Cleo and that great dance. What kind of person is Cleo? Again, her detractors are many. The conservative British political theorist Michael Oakeshott opined, the historian loves Cleo precisely because she is so capricious, a mistress of whom he never tires, and whom he never expects to talk sense. The Christian Herbert Butterfield lamented that in the 19th century, for many people, Cleo was all things to all men. She is at the services of good causes and bad. In other words, she is a harlot and a hireling. But these are all undeserved. It is not Cleo, history, who is at fault. It is man. We have tortured and twisted her to whatever end our current isms have demanded. Instead, I have this picture. Cleo can be a valuable tutor and guide. Imagine Circle 6 in Dante's Inferno, when Dante is stuck in the city of Dis before the gates and he can't go further. And he's lost all hope. And here comes this bright angelic figure, this Beatrice. As we stumble through the darkness, Beatrice can, as a kind of Cleo, can teach us, if we're humble enough to listen, to lift our countenances from the morass that is the fallen world around us. And more importantly, to recognize our desire for something so much higher and our need for our Redeemer to get us there. Thank you.
Welcome back to our afternoon session. Trust that your discussions were fruitful and challenging, and maybe that you left with some serious questions that you'd like to see addressed. What we're going to do is allow three PhD professors to give a brief response to the lecture, and then we will open it up to questions from the faculty and then to your questions. This is a kind of, this is how an academic setting would often proceed. A paper would be given, and then 1, 2, 3 other academics would respond to the paper. So you're going to get a kind of sense of how these things work. So the order that our respondents will take will be first Dr. Spinney, then Dr. Baer, and finally Dr. McRoberts. And they each will speak for 5 to 6 minutes. So Dr. Spinney.
So Dr. Favelo raised this whole issue of what is the proper purpose of history, and here are some phrases I took out of what he said. The proper purpose of history: to draw people to a nobler life, to spur citizens toward virtue, to empower men and women to better fulfill their divine vocations, and then to live better, to live excellently, to live well, to live so you have an impact. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is something different from what Dr. Favelo did. Instead of discussing that subject, what's the proper purpose of history, I thought I would explain how that subject has worked out practically in my life as a professional historian. And in particular, I became a professional historian because I saw history doing those things in me, even before I was a historian. So this involves a little story, doesn't it? So here's my story. In college, I earned an undergraduate degree in political theory.
Is that picking up? Can you hear all right? Yeah.
Okay. So in college, my degree was in political theory with a minor in history, but it was mostly political theory. And so I graduated and had student loans to pay off, and I needed a job really badly, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And there was a little Christian school down the road, and I walked in, I think in early August, and I saw the headmaster and said, "Do y'all need a teacher?" And he kind of looked at me and he said, "Can you teach math?" And I said, "Sure." And so for the next 6 years, I was the math department of a small Christian school. A month into my first year of teaching, the chemistry teacher quit, so I taught chemistry also. So if anybody ever asks you, if people ask you, what do you do with a political theory degree? Say, well, Rob taught math and chemistry, right? So, and I still enjoy teaching math. Love doing math. To me, it's just like doing puzzles. It's like Sudoku or something, right? It's just puzzle solving. So it's just fun. I love teaching math. But after 6 years of teaching math and chemistry, I left teaching and I left paychecks and went back to graduate school for 6 more years, 6 years of school, was already married, had 2 small children, so this wasn't really kind of an easy route to follow, but went back to school, got my master's, my PhD in history. And the reason I went back to graduate school, the reason I went back to get degrees in history and not math, was that during those 6 years of teaching history, history drew me to a nobler life. And it spurred me toward virtue, and it helped me to live better, and to live excellently, and to live well. And during those 6 years, I was not a historian. That's kind of important to the story. Now, I was a newish Christian. I was not reared in a Christian family. And early on in my Christian life, someone introduced me to Charles Spurgeon. He's a British preacher in the second half of the 1800s, and to the Puritans, who dominated the 1600s, both in England and in colonial America. And they introduced me to David Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a British preacher in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And someone suggested I read Jonathan Edwards, early 1700s, colonial America. And I read these people's sermons, and I read their books, and I read a lot of them, and they became my spiritual heroes. Because they applied the Word of God to the totality of their lives. And as a result, they lived differently, and they lived better. And I think what struck me the most about these people, and it still stands out to me today, was how Spurgeon and the Puritans and D. Martin Lloyd-Jones and Edwards were all deeply reverential. I mean, they were always worshipful. No matter what they were saying or writing, there was this spirit of worship about it, that they surely loved God, but they also feared God. And I wasn't seeing that around me, but in these guys, I saw that. In these people, I saw that. These were the first Christians I'd ever come across who seemed more calibrated for heaven than for earth. And that was really attractive. I admired how they were so careful when they interpreted and taught the Bible. I mean, they studied so they could exegete Scripture accurately. And I didn't always agree with everything that they wrote and believed. But I was always provoked to think more carefully, and to think more intentionally, and to think more rigorously. And it seemed like, just one last thing, it seemed to me like they were more aware than I was of how our culture, how the values and the goals and the assumptions of one's community influence how we understand Scripture. And how they were always vigilant to kind of make sure that their cultural peer pressure wasn't pushing them into unbiblical or extra biblical interpretations. And these people became my role models in part because they were real life, everyday people. And I read these folks and I said, that can be me. I mean, I can emulate that. I mean, that's possible for me. And history changed my life. History dramatically improved my life. It improved my Christian life, which meant it improved my life in general. It empowered me to both find a divine vocation and then to fulfill it. So that's what caused me to go back to graduate school. I said, I want to reap even more benefits from history. And I went back to graduate school so I could hopefully help others learn how to live a nobler life, a more excellent life by knowing history. And that's why, at least that's what caused me to be a professional historian, because I saw history's high telos make me a better person. Okay. Thank you.
Pull this forward. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I want to thank Dr. Favelo for this paper. I quite enjoyed reading it. I mean, and I do agree with his remark that the ordinary person seems to think of history as merely a matter of practical use, to keep people from repeating past errors, or as he put it, well, more like Cassandra, whose warnings go unheeded. In the Academy, history has, of course, become a work of positivism, as it is one among the many new sciences. Scientism is the overriding telos, and it seems to me that that Dr. Favelo is engaged in a worthy project to offer a purpose for the writing of history, to answer the question, what should history do? And he answers the question by remarking that it should tell people that there's a truth, a reality which governs their lives, and this reality is God. And so I'd like to turn at this point to make a few comments to clarify what I think might help think about this. You began by remarking that the ancient Greeks seem to have viewed their history as an important way to understand themselves. Like philosophy, it is directed to comprehending the purposes and ends of man. In, of course, ancient Greece, the playwrights, the philosophers, and the historians were engaged in the search for truth as they could understand it as pagans. Today, a political philosopher still benefits from reading the Peloponnesian War if he wants to understand Plato and Aristotle. And I have to say, appearances to the contrary, when Aristotle said in the Poetics that history is concerned with particulars, it was not really a slight. The recounting of the particulars of history, of course, teaches. Of course, teaches, and as Polybius put it, that the history of a great people is the greatest teacher. And the American framers, of course, all read Plutarch, and Plutarch inspired their admiration of Cicero and Cato and the Roman Republicans. Why else did they choose Publius Cincinnatus and other Roman heroes for pen names? As Dr. Favelo noted it, this type of Roman Republican man, strong of will, persevering through adversity, stoic in the face of danger, ambitious for the Republic rather than for personal gain, was the model for the framers of civic virtue. You did suggest, of course, generally speaking, that Roman histories have not the high telos of Greek histories, but that seems not to have limited their influence on later generations, which, of course, raises the question of exactly what is meant by high telos. Is it to universalize the principles of human action through retelling events from the past in such a way as to approach the truth, or is it to have lasting influence? So if I understand the paper correctly, the question then turns to what have Christian histories to do with this? What have Christian historians to do with this particular question? I mean, if this is the case, I think I will begin by disagreeing just a little with the point about the Middle Ages. And one of the interesting things about the Middle Ages is that the model of history writing changed, but only because there was a higher standard of moral virtue, a higher telos. One might say it this way: the cardinal virtues which inform pagan morality were added to, augmented to, improved, changed by the new morals, the faith, hope, and charity, the theological virtues. Augustine's history of Rome, the city of God, is indeed a history, but it is Roman history retold as salvation history. Now, that may be because of its theology, but that theology, of course, offered the telos and provides Augustine with an explanation for why it is that we are men of the city of God, heaven first, and the city of man second. And so politics, of course, becomes subservient or guided by theology. And then, therefore, the histories, the hagiographic stories of the saints, then can be read as history, I think, because in the grand order of providence, it appears that their lives are part of salvation history, the whole history of the church. Now, it seems to me that this is good. Christians see each person's life, I think, if we're looking at the Middle Ages, in light of the role they play in building up the kingdom of God. Dante's not a historian, of course, but the merging of poetry and history and theology into one work illustrates what I'm trying to get at, which is that what you're putting together here is the truth of reality. But it still is history, right? Because you're hearing in the poem is telling the stories of real individual people who were working out their own salvation or not working it out, right? But it's a history of real people. It's just that you're seeing it set in this larger Christian context. Now, in the later Middle Ages, before the Renaissance, a more worldly perspective returns. There's a kind of loss of the Augustinian perspective. After the discovery of Aristotle in the 12th century, greater attention was paid to this world. Political works were again being written a little bit more like pagan works, which merged moral instruction with history. And I'm thinking here of Mirrors of Princes. And the intention of writing these was to urge young princes to virtue, to hold up great people as exemplars. And then, of course, there were the chronicles. A 14th century chronicler, Froissart, wrote about the ethos of the age of chivalry and the 100 Years' War. And he, too, has a kind of telos in the sense that he's looking at history as his writing of history as a means to critique his time. But in the Renaissance, interest in Plutarch, Livy, Cicero returned, and this revival of interest in classical pre-Christian history brought back, indeed, modern political philosophy, whose focus was on this world, rather than understanding ourselves as beings who are on a horizon between this world and the next. And of course, you get Machiavelli, thinking of the effect of Livy and Tacitus there. From the standpoint of philosophy, of course, Machiavelli's work has a very low telos. But if the good purpose of history is not only to inform us about human nature, but if the good purpose of history is not only to inform us about human nature, but in fact to tell us about the city of God, of course, the story goes downhill. It's a complicated story. It is interesting, however, that histories continue to play a part in the development of political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes was a great classicist. He published the first English language translation of Thucydides. It is said that he composed his treatises with a copy of Thucydides at his side. He thought the human soul dominated by a ceaseless desire for power after power, and this does sound like Thucydides indeed. But unfortunately, I would say his reading of the Peloponnesian War had the effect of teaching him only about human failure, not about their striving for virtue. And that's the story of early modern political thought in part. It returns to classical history, but it takes classical history to depict a kind of dark, morally relativistic, skeptical human nature. In the 18th century, there's a revival of models of classical virtue following Plutarch. But that is also not a return of that high, what I would call the high telos. Even though it's good, right? It's good. It talks about the need for personal virtue as the foundation of classical republicanism. At the end of the paper, Dr. Favelo remarked that what is missing from history today is a sense of the high telos history, a telos which makes it important. And of course, with this, I would agree. And it's also the case, I think, that you are right to note that people are not happy with a low telos history, that they do actually want to read books about heroes. They want to go to movies which depict Churchill as a great hero, for example. So people still want history to reveal truth, goodness, and beauty. But it seems that it is going to be more than history that helps do this. The history is going to have to be part of a larger project, and the whole larger project is the revival of Christian theology and philosophy as offering a centering vision, as it did in the Middle Ages. The problem, of course, is that we're not medieval. Their lives seem very foreign to us in our technological age, and so it really is a serious question. How does one write this history again, thinking about the city of God as the human telos when it seems nearly impossible because we have become such positivists? So I just would conclude by saying that in a way, what we're doing here at Patrick Henry College with the core is an attempt to actually think about how it is that, in fact, history becomes part of one of the ways in which we come to understand moral virtue, and that it's complemented by all of the different disciplines. And that it's the project of reviving the human mind, the human Christian mind. Anyway, I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Favelo, for your insightful essay on the high purpose of history, or the high telos history in a low telos world. High telos history seeks the true, noble, and beautiful behind which stands the Son of God, who is the glory of the Father. And you certainly encourage us to see these virtues in light of the revelation of Christ as playing out through all history. Conversely, I understood low telos history as any history which has the purpose other than the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And among this low telos history, you place history as admonition. Now, perhaps the admonitory purposes of history encourages the adoption of a moralizing tone, which in turn tends to deform history. I wasn't sure exactly in how it got there, but you placed it squarely within the low telos. And here I need to disagree on your dismissing of history as warning or admonition as simply low telos history. As you describe it, low telos history includes history as a cautionary tale of what to avoid in one's personal life or the life of a nation. But human nature and the life of a nation, the personal writ large, being stubbornly rebellious, needs to have history ever present as an admonition against such proclivities. Beginning even in the Garden of Eden, before man's rebellion had even occurred, the pair received the prohibition or admonition of not eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, lest things go not well for them. In other words, the story of Adam and Eve's life will not go well if they ignore the prohibition. Adam promptly ignored the warning at the behest of his sated wife, and the rest is history. God has been guiding man through the warnings of history ever since. The flood, for example, stands as a profound warning for the consequences of a world turned utterly sinful in its every thought. God even renews his divine warning of universal destruction with the sulfurous incineration of Sodom and Gomorrah. As early Jewish exegetes and even Jude in the New Testament recognize, the destruction of Sodom gave warning for the final eschatological destruction of the world. God may have promised in the rainbow not to destroy the world with flood again, but reserved for the future, nonetheless, an even more thoroughgoing destruction with fire. God gave Israelites many warnings for their history against the consequences of rebelliousness. For the Israelites, the history of Egypt's misfortune with the 10 plagues and the destruction of their entire army and the Red Sea became a monition repeated down its own history in their history books, in their Psalms, as warnings of running across purposes of their mighty God Yahweh. Israel's own rebellious history in the desert also finds frequent mention in the Psalms. And Paul himself reminds the new Israel in his letter to the church at Corinth of the generation of Israelites whose bodies falling in the desert were a warning against the rebellious heart. Their enjoyment of the spiritual food and drink did not secure them against the consequences of their sin. None except Joshua and Caleb entered the promised land. And just as God had used this history as warning against the historical Israel, so now Paul employs it against the new Israel. History will retain this unfortunate purpose even to the utter ends of time. According to Revelation, human history becomes the story of all humanity under leadership of the Antichrist, bound in allegiance to Satan against God. This alliance of man against God culminates in the Battle of Armageddon, an eminently historical event, even in terms of secular history, being a great battle. While the battle occurs at the end of this age, it nevertheless will remain as a dire cautionary story to future generations of humanity during the 1,000-year kingdom, established and ruled by Christ in person. Even with this catastrophic worldwide reminder of the consequences of rebellion against the one true God, despite the very presence of the perfect King of Kings, Christ, all the nations will, heedless of the warning of history, rebel again, once the great dragon is released from the abyss and deceives the nations. God has spoken through the warning of history and will continue to speak even to the end of this mortal age, well after even our age has become nothing more than an admonition of history. And if God so generously employs admonition as part of his historical address to mankind, even during the perfect 1,000-year kingdom, should we really deem it as lo telos? The classical studies which Dr. Favelo mentions evince this use of history. Both Herodotus and Thucydides do seek the truth insofar as they were able to comprehend the historical truth. They do seek the higher virtues. But for Herodotus, the history of the Persians became a cautionary story for the Greeks. The Persians became overgreat, hubristic in their conduct. They offended the gods by overstepping their territorial bounds and found themselves brought down in a sudden calamitous destruction at the hands of the up-and-coming Greeks, especially the Athenians. For Thucydides, the Athenians' empire transformed into Herodotus' Persians. Their city became a hubristic tyrant city in the midst of the Greek world, which met its eventual tragic downfall. Like the Persians, they overstepped their proper bounds by invading Sicily. Where Herodotus narrates the promise of Athens, Thucydides narrates the squandering of the promise, with the warning left unheeded. Thucydides wrote his history in part as a warning for all time against the repetition of such events. As Christians who have direct access to the throne of God, we must approach and seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit in helping us to understand the admonitions of history, the history of Israel, the church, history of the church, and even our own nation or even our own family. And even if this is an undertaking fraught with many difficulties and the perils of misguided moralizing, we should not diminish this dimension of history as merely a low telos history, best reserved for the appendices of our books. Thank you.
And we're going to give Dr. Favelo a few minutes to respond to these comments.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. I'll respond to Dr. Spinney first. I appreciate your wisdom in the application of what I was talking about. We talk about narration, explanation, and application, and Dr. Spinney gave a good example of that. So I'm glad you chose those paths. And I think the word that came to mind while you were speaking and giving these examples of stories is a fancy word, liminality, and thresholdness, if you like not fancy words, okay, that I just made up. Thresholdness, it's the already but not yet. A number of writers on Christianity have talked about Christianity
in this world is the already but not yet principle, okay? It's Jesus Christ standing before his disciples and saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. You look around, you see a bunch of Roman soldiers pushing around Jews, and looks not very good. But we know that God was right in front of them. So, I think you captured this perfectly. We read stories of also fallen men and women, but these examples who spurred you on to living better, and we say, yeah, we have to be just conscious of it. It's so hard. I was talking to Dr. Bayer at lunch. It's so hard to do anything contrary to what we live in, because that's what we know. It's like a fish not being in water. And so we have to be constantly kind of pinpricked, spurred, to remember that we're in this world, but we're not of this world. And I think the people you read, Spurgeon, et cetera, and of course biblical figures and lots of figures in history, good high telos history, helps us to live differently. So I appreciate what you said there. Dr. Bayer, this is my weak point right here. The medieval period's tough. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. I teach in my Western Civ classes. I say the medieval period. This is so non-humanistic. It's so a low view of humanity. The whole point is to get out, get to heaven, because you're probably going to be there really soon, anyways, right? Because of diseases and barbarians and stuff. But there's a really smart guy. His name is Francis Schaeffer. Okay, wrote a very popular book, who says, in fact, the Middle Ages are absolutely the most humanistic period in history. You say, what? How the Middle Ages? He says, because one man, the Pope, pretty much controlled everything. And that's the epitome of humanism, when one man makes the rules. That's an interesting way to think about it. So this idea that the medieval period, medieval historians are actually high telos because they look at the whole world through the lens of the Bible, let's say, or at least through the church. It's a tough one. One problem I have is that because medieval historians generally don't insist upon source verification. I'm thinking of accounts of the Battle of Tours where no one went and actually investigated and asked people who were there, did this really go down like this? It just was a good story because somebody thought they heard a trumpet blow and the Muslims all ran amok. To me, that's bad history because it's not actually trying to figure out at the very least what happened. But I do take your point that at least medieval historians are looking for the grand story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. Augustine is tough to deal with. He's tough because he absolutely has that full view. And I think we historians need to have that, frankly. We need to have the full view. Does he do actual good history of source verification? Well, on one hand, as I mentioned in my Western Civ classes, God himself doesn't need to verify his source in the Bible, right? But now I will say, hagiography, I love Polycarp. Everybody who's been in my class knows I love Polycarp, right? He's a snarky guy who loves Jesus. But did he really, when he was stabbed, and I'm totally not opposed to the idea of the miraculous, but when he was stabbed, did the fluid, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Christ himself, but did the fire not touch his body when he was immolated? No one tried to verify that, and so that bothers me as history. There's still a lesson to be learned there, right? There's still a lesson to be learned. I agree with that. So I don't know. I'll give more thought to that about whether or not it really is high history, and they're given a free pass too. I have in my notes here this idea of Thucydides. Thucydides is also difficult, right? Because he's capturing a war that the Athenians ultimately lose. Okay. He's also difficult because he dies mid-sentence. Okay. So he was writing it. We don't know. We know what happens at the end of the war, but we don't know how he would end his telling, right? Is this kind of a tragic play before us that in reality? But I see in something like funeral oration, which Western Civ students have to read this week, right? Make sure you do it. The funeral oration, we see Pericles saying Greece at its best. We're the school of Hellas, school of Greece, school of the world, of people who don't settle. And I think there's a great lesson there. But anyways, you still have me thinking, Dr. Baer. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Dr. McRoberts. So I actually do mention when I'm talking about Polybius that I'm not saying we cannot learn from mistakes. And I agree. I mean, you're not going to tell the story of King David without the Bathsheba story or the census story, which is even a greater sin, arguably, in the light of Scripture. But you're going to do that. And I agree. Admonition is important, all right? What I'm looking for a kind of reorientation about how much we do this, right? Because all history is picking and choosing. You can't tell the story of everybody. It's just not possible. So we have to pick and choose. We have limited resources. And I'm thinking of David right now, okay? So we look at the story of David. We can do a low telos, just look at the negatives, the bad examples, but that's not what Scripture does. Scripture thinks about, he's a man after God's own heart. He's a Christ typos, right? He's a type. He's pointing towards Jesus. And I think there's that positive, I hate to use the word spin because it's Scripture, but there's that positive outlook that I'm trying to emphasize. And I think an example from Jewish history, another one is Ebenezer stones. So God absolutely, multiple times, we have Moses giving the song of the curse and the song of life, right? The blessing. And there are two mountains, and half the Jews are over here, and half the Jews are over here. But I think the focus is on choose life. Even though the actual section of the curse is quite a bit larger than the choose life section. Ebenezer stones, the Jews are instructed to put these gigantic stones, and what does it say? Thus far the Lord has brought us. Thus far the Lord has brought us. Praise God for his mercy that looks toward really his goodness working out. And I would just note this, the Bible begins and ends with perfection. Okay? For sure, we look at the bad within, we remember it. We remember the Egypts, okay? We remember the apostasy. But the Bible begins and ends with glorious pictures. And I think that's what I'm thinking of when I think of do history, right? With that eternal perspective, though I completely agree, we have to have that admonition in there. So, thank you for your comments, Dr. McRoberts.
Let's take a question or two from faculty, if anybody wants to ask one. Yes, there's a microphone there, Dr. Haig.
I'm curious, Doug, do you see anybody doing the kind of high telos history now that might be an example of what this might look like? Are there any examples out there?
Well, my first answer is it's happening a lot, but it's being done in other media, like documentaries and then film as well. I'm sure it's being done in just flat-out history books, but the most popular is things like David McCullough and Aaron Metaxas, but these, of course, are biography, and that bothers me that biography has taken center stage in a kind of high telos. Look at these examples. These are people, the Bonhoeffers, whom we should emulate. I'm sure it does happen in the history world. Of course, the problem is when Dan Brown is on the New York Times bestseller list for as long as he was, that tells me something's wrong. And when the people of the world think that that's actually history. I mean, he went on, I can't remember which morning show it was, and was asked, what would you have to do, Dan Brown, to make the Da Vinci Code history? He said, nothing. It's true. And so the greater academia at large and the greater history ingesting populace is not aware of it, so it's not being done on the grand scale. I'm sure there are Christian historians, frankly, this might sound like the preacher preaching to the choir. I think homeschool kind of curricula do this a lot. Let's look at great heroes, almost to the extent of ignoring the flaws, right? Everything Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar did was fantastic. Well, No, there's actually a children's Plutarch, and you have to rip out a lot to get that. So it's being done, I think, in the conservative community. That's why I do think it's like the preacher preaching to the choir. You'll see this in homeschool curricula a lot, but it's just that's a small inroad to the greater population at large. But then the movies. I mean, people come out of a movie like Lincoln, I thought was fantastic, and we can have our debates about Abraham Lincoln and himself, but showing a heroic man in a lot of ways. There's a lot of flaws too. So it's being done, but I would say not enough.
And I might add that the members of our panel feel free to jump in whenever you like. All right?
Good, then I'll jump in.
There you go.
At least among trained professional historians with PhDs teaching at universities, I don't think hardly anyone's doing high Telos history. Hardly anyone. That just doesn't work in the academy. And when you see the rare exception, and David McCullough is a great example. David McCullough is a trained professional historian. That means he knows how to work with sources, he's sophisticated, he does those kinds of things. He opted out of university. He's an independent scholar, not under the control of university. To have high Telos history, and Dr. Favelo alluded to this in his message, almost presupposes some things are better than others. Right? There are some good things and some bad things, and we should aspire to the good things. And that just is not trendy anymore, right?
And let me add, a big part of this, you hit it right on the nose, Dr. Spinney. A lot of this is because of the system of the university. So to get tenure, because everybody wants tenure, you make more money and you can't be fired. So to do that, you have to have 2 articles and a book. It doesn't matter. Okay, I shouldn't say quality doesn't matter, but you have to do it. And if every historian is trying to do this, there's not this thoughtful participation, this slow consideration. Then when you add politics in the matter, because there's no way we're going to let that conservative guy get tenure at a department, or we got to make sure that this toes party line, all right, in pick your favorite collegiate system, then you have a real hard time writing stuff like this.
A history book that was just published, I've only read a review, I haven't read the book, by Wilford McClay called Land of Hope. At least the title suggests some kind of aspirational intentions in the book. And Bill McClay, who has spoken here at PHC some years ago, is a well-known historian and a very good man. So that might be an example, notable by its rarity, because he wrote the book because he couldn't find anything that was doing the job that he thought should be done. Another question from faculty? Yes. Well, go ahead with microphone so we can all hear, and it can be recorded for posterity, for history.
Ignorance of the scientist. You don't define history or what you mean by it. So given that, my question is your high telos really some sort of combination of sociology, psychology, and all the other social science disciplines, and you're lumping it all under history, rather than what now is in the university idea of history? And then when you're giving historians a hard time about tenure, they have to get it in history. And perhaps after they had tenure, they can pontificate on a broader scale, meaning including sociology, psychology, and other dynamics. But in the starting process, it's too soon in their careers to do something like that. So again, is your high telos really a mishmash of all the rest of the social sciences?
Is my high telos a mishmash? I'm going to respond, wear my heart on my sleeve, and say that the disciplines you mentioned back in the day were part of history, because history was not just things that happened. History is about people. People are the psychologists, sociologists. These are fields that came out of the 19th century, lo and behold, when people could be reduced down to atoms and proteins and things like this. But, I mean, if we had Herodotus here, if I had Herodotus right here, he'd say, just look at the word psychology from psyche, soul, in Greek. It's the logos of the soul. No one who's talking about that in modern psychology departments. So I'd say what we've done in the 19th century is we've subdivided people down to this almost reducible, quantifiable, beaker-fiable set of proteins. But Herodotus, he would talk about the soul. He'd say we're talking about people and their decisions, and that is the domain of history, I would say. And now the question of, they have to do it to get tenure. I work at a college that doesn't have tenure, so so if I'm not here tomorrow, you know why. But
we need you for the rest of the semester.
all right, fair enough. Yeah, I question those disciplines. And interestingly, and actually I know you went to a college that does it right, where history is in the humanities still, and I know you studied very much of this. The humanities, right, the humanitas of people. History is about human beings. But your college, that's pretty rare. Most colleges, it's part of the social sciences department, because again, people are just kind of data, numbers to be tracked, and that's not true.
Just a quick and pithy definition of history for us so we can kind of track with that.
How about the study of humans?
Okay.
One philosopher of history said history is the study of everything. Well, that's awfully bold, right?
It's an interesting question, and it really does get to the province of various disciplines, right? And is history an adequately integrating discipline? Because a historian has to pick and choose subject matter. He evaluates subject matter, which implies that he is coming to the subject matter with certain values, which at least suggests that maybe he has to have a kind of philosophical or even theological framework before he even embarks on the enterprise, which then suggests that maybe there's something prior that needs to be in place before he is a historian or can even be a historian.
Yes. I'm thinking right now of the trivium and the quadrivium, the idea of a classical education. Does everybody get that history is not in the trivium or quadrivium? Well, what's up with that, right? I mean, isn't it as important as things like astronomy, which is, we'll call it the sciences? And the answer is history was almost the language that you spoke to get to study those disciplines. So it's almost the ABCs of at least a Greek education. Now, the values, the presuppositions, of course, you're going to have that. I would argue that that true history should come with that basic biblical worldview, which is anything but basic, right? Which is going to require a great deal of philosophical understanding of the word to do it well.
It seems it's pretty complicated because in one respect, all we have is history, right?
Exactly.
But history cannot simply be a collection of facts. So we organize and arrange facts according to some set of values or presuppositions or priorities. And so there's at least a kind of complex relationship between the philosophical reflections on the past and the fact that, well, it's always going to be reflecting on the past to some extent because, I mean, even language itself is inherited from the past. And so there's a very complex kind of dynamic going on here, regardless of how we define history.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to say something?
Not only, but just to your point that doing history requires the historian to come to the facts with some kind of philosophical approach, some set of values, some presuppositions, and the answer is yes. How can you not come to anything without a set of presuppositions, values, and facts? So the question isn't, do you come to the facts with an agenda and presuppositions, or do you come with none at all? And nobody comes with none at all. The question is, do you come to the facts with a thoughtful, intentional set of values and facts, or you just kind of do it by the seat of your pants and go, I know this kind of seems right, just don't think about it. So
yeah. Even like the idea of periodization is so difficult. So ancient historians, some are doing it by summers, some are doing it by the year of the consul. Things like, great battle example, BCE CE, right? There's a philosophical, there's a theological, there's a battle that goes on because of when BCE CE has won in the academy, which is sad. But here's what's so interesting. Everybody knows what CE means, common era. What do you define as the common era? The life of Yeshua Bar Yosef of Nazareth, okay? Yeah, I call that guy Jesus. I understand if you don't want to say Anno Domini in the year of the Lord. He's not your Lord. That's your call. It's a bad call. But you've used an agenda and a bias here for your periodization to call it something else. So, anyways, hope that makes sense.
Any more jumping in?
Well, I'm formulating something just to add to this. I was just thinking, though, that the difficulty then is that when it comes to looking at facts through a different set of presuppositions, one doesn't want to end up in relativism, right? So how do you go, so that the larger problem is, how do you in fact say this is the truth, right? So how do you say that your interpretation of the facts is the true?
You got me there. Well, one, we're going to do it with a great deal of humility. When we write our histories, we're going to say, I've interpreted these documents as such. I've done the best work I can. I know I could be wrong on this. And we're going to have that kind of humility and a graciousness, including, and a charity, which you've talked about this, Dr. Mitchell, a charity toward the dead, right? People in the past, charity is, caritas is love towards those. And I don't exactly know why you did that thing, okay? Benedict Arnold. I mean, I can look at the data here, look at the documents, but can I really get into your heart? I don't know, but here's my best guess, but I want to be very charitable about that. And I would say the Bible talks about how in a plurality of counselors, right, there's victory. I think we also need to not do this in a vacuum, and certainly not simply just so I can get this puppy published so I can get my tenure, right? Having a better outlook, I want to glorify the Lord. There's going to be a humility in that, and you might seek that outside counsel. And we have peer review and other institutional ways to hopefully ensure a good product. But I don't have a perfect answer for that, that's for sure. It's a tough one.
Just don't publish the puppy. Let's go to student questions. Dr. Siller's group.
If the point of high telos of a high telos view of history is to inspire virtue, can't embellishment inspire virtue? Can we say that embellishment is always antithetical to a high telos of history, given examples in history where people are inspired to great deeds from blatantly embellished stories? For example, the Allied stories of military heroism or even the conditions of war during World War II that may have been totally inaccurate but convinced people to join the war effort.
Yeah. So when I hear the word embellishment, I'm hearing a pejorative term, all right? I hear fudging of the facts. And so I think that's not the historian's domain. I do think historians need to paint that picture accurately and winsomely. And the problem is every time we lie, we destroy our credibility. I just read a story of an African-American soldier late in World War I who fought off 6 Germans by himself, got shot a whole bunch of times. And if that story turned out to be false, which there's no evidence otherwise, as far as I know, but if that story were false, there's a kind of lying, there's a deception that is damaging. So I don't think historians want to embellish, but every time you write a history, you have to cut. It's impossible. No one can read 10,000-page histories to know every single thing about George Washington, right? There's just too many documents, too many letters. So I would say don't embellish, but paint a winsome story. I mean, think about our own Bible, right? Doesn't John say if we wrote everything down that Jesus did, it would fill volumes upon volumes upon volumes that the world could not even hold. But we get those those nuggets that show us the nature of Jesus Christ, and there's no embellishment there.
David and Kiara's group.
kind of intimidated.
This is kind of along the same lines as the last question, actually. The Lord of the Rings film trilogy opens in part with the phrase, history became legend, legend became myth. And so from the Aeneid to Saving Private Ryan, we've had stories that are grounded in history and yet are not true. But as you noted in your paper, Dr. Favelo, there are a lot of these stories that accomplish the same purpose as high telos history. So our question is, how do we discern between the telos of history and the telos of myth, especially as it relates to the importance of fact in history?
Well, I was hoping that word would not come up in this Faith and Reason lecture. This takes a long time, and even the idea of unpacking it. What a difficult question. We're talking about the relationship between history, myth, literature. We can even throw journalism in there. Dr. Sillers and I have had many conversations about this. Myth. The Greeks themselves had a hard time distinguishing. I mean, did the average Greek think you could really climb Mount Olympus and really end up in the banquet of the gods? It's so hard to know. The Greeks would probably punt, I would say, and say, who knows, who can know such things, but what can we learn from this, all right? But Herodotus, if he had flat out lied, the Greeks will call each other on it, okay? This is not true. This is not true. How do you know that? And I think at some point when we start marketing, and I'm thinking of some historians who've gotten a lot of trouble for not telling whole stories about, for example, founding fathers. I think we do a disservice there. Maybe you've made a myth. Okay, so the George Washington and the cherry tree kind of idea. Maybe you've told a story there, and maybe it in and of itself is valuable, but once you start damaging history's credibility, I don't think we do ourselves a service there. So I do think we need a kind of delineation, but we remember that we're all cousins, just like the muses. Poetry, epic poetry, lyric poetry, and history, they're all next to each other. There's certainly a cross-pollination, if you will. But I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings, so here's a good example. That last battle of the Pelennor Fields, that big charge, right? Is that what it's called, right? That's taken from Jan Sobieski. You know the Poles had to come into this talk, right? Jan Sobieski was a Christian man who believed that Jesus Christ was in charge and wanted him to do something, namely lead 10,000 men to attack an armed Muslim army, a Turkish army of about 200,000 men. Just charge down a field, right? On September 11th, by the way. And he did. And he probably would have died, but he didn't die. He didn't. It's a real event, right? So I'm not saying don't have our Lord of the Rings with our Battle of the Pelennor Fields, but I'm saying let's also have our history of Jan Sobieski. And when he had won that battle and saved, I would make a case he saved Christianity in Europe in a lot of ways. When he saved Europe at that battle, and he said, I came, I saw, Deus vicit, God conquered. God conquered. Right? That's a very powerful story that we can say, when I'm faced with this whatever hard thing, am I gonna cheat on this test? Am I gonna steal from the till? Am I going to just flat out gossip about my friend or cheat on my marriage or whatever? There are great stories out there where you say there are people who stood for what's right, and they get remembered, and more importantly, they're gonna stand before the Lord. He's gonna say, well done. And I think that's a powerful, unique spot for history itself. And yes, I did dodge myth, okay?
If in a myth, the hero is heroic because he's able to turn himself invisible, that's not going to inspire you to great deeds because you can't turn yourself invisible. But if in the myth, the hero is heroic because he's loyal, that may well inspire you to be loyal, because you can do those things. So I would argue the only time myths can inspire people to do great things is when they masquerade as history, or when they do the things that history properly does.
I'm just wondering what a literature person would say to this, because if you have a literary depiction of a hero who can't go invisible, who does noble and inspiring things, how does the reading of history, does it inspire us in a different way than the reading of a great work of fiction? Certainly when we read a great work of fiction, we often find ourselves saying, yes, so true, that's true, even though we're not meaning historical, but true. And so is there a clear difference or a preference from one over the other? Or are these just two different modes of expressing the same ideals?
To our lit professors?
Well, I'm not going to comment on it as a lit professor, but I remember David Aikman was looking for compelling stories that are true stories as a journalist / historian. And I think Dr. Sillars, I mean, his book about, was it Cambodia? You know, in other words, there are a lot of stories out there that are inspiring, that are compelling, that are very historical and very true. And so that, I don't see that as in opposition to literature. I see it as complementary. But that would be something that would, you know, and they were wanting to tell those stories and to, you know, we have a lot of novels and a lot of fiction, but we don't have as many of those kinds of stories, you know. So
if our goal is the true one, the truth, I'm thinking aloud here. Is history, our history and literature and journalism as close as history is to music? Because we're all looking at that one source, and we or even let's say a math problem, for example, right? We're all around, I've described classical education like this. Jesus in the center, and different disciplines can look at it from different perspectives, but we're looking at this same source. It's easier because lit and history, they just seem so close, right? Like War and Peace. War and Peace is a good example. So we know Tolstoy visited the Battle of Borodino battlefield, and we know that he interviewed veterans from Borodino, okay? But then that's really, the Borodino is really just a backdrop for people to fall in love, okay? So I just wonder if we obsess over the differences so much, there must be, oh, this is, I hear this a lot these days, stay in your lane. There are lanes, right? People criticize, stay in your lane. There are lanes, but we're going to kind of look over at each other and say, what can you help me understand from this, right? You teach a class on music and politics. I mean, how wonderful to understand the Polish rebellion in the 19th century, but also the music that comes out of it. Oh my goodness, am I right on this? Chopin also, yes. Okay, Chopin made amazing pieces from that rebellion, real event, and there's a story there too in the music.
This is from Brianna's wing.
So, given that stories are important for pointing us to the sublime and that our world incessantly documents everything on social media, what is the place for ordinary stories in high telos history, and how do we filter the data created by our culture to tell the true story?
The Facebook question, yeah. Right, so part of this question, it's a good question. We're not probably going to fight at the Second Siege of Vienna. Right? We're probably not going to have that moment. But the counter to that is, the temptation. The enemy would lead us, hey, this doesn't matter that much. Do you really need to be a person of integrity? I mean, you're not handling national government secrets. No one's going to die. But compromise starts there, too. So I think there's value in telling a story about that small town hero, okay? Do it well, capture the reality, and also, if there, as with all stories, there might be some of those black eye moments, those fallen moments in that person's life, but say why this person on the micro scale mattered and how they stood for what's good and true and beautiful. And let's do that, okay? How do we filter the data created by our culture to tell the true story? Okay, I don't have an answer for this, other than I would just say, let's stay on our toes. Let's test every spirit. There's so many lies out there, right? The problem with social media is there is no filter. Everything is allowed, but it's not all true. And we have to be careful with that. And think about identity, right? The people who are speaking this, are they pointing us towards our true identity in Christ? Well, no, they're just, they're coming at from worldviews that we know are hostile to the truth. But again, that is just me as a 21st century husband and dad trying to figure out how to, protect my kids from Facebook.
Is there a distinction between the what you might call the heroic virtues and the mundane or everyday virtues that's sort of lurking in the back of that question? Mm-hmm. And that sometimes we may get overly concerned with or focused on the heroic virtues, that we forget about simple things like being reliable and self-controlled and generous and such?
My opinion is there is a difference, but the two are so intimately linked. Because look, if you are stealing from the till or gossiping, and we've all gossiped, okay, I get that. Every time you point, right, 3 fingers pointing back, okay, that's why you point like this, okay. Don't take that, right. If you're gossiping or stealing from the till, or not capturing those thoughts right, or just not being charitable toward others, who says when that moment comes for the heroic virtue, you're actually going to stand there? And when we think about Marathon, does everybody get Marathon was a bunch of Greek farmers? A bunch of Greek farmers who just kind of wanted their wheat to grow and they didn't want to be pillaged and their wives and kids murdered. And they said, now we have to show up. And they cast a vote to do it. They all voted, and they knew exactly what that vote meant, and they showed up. I don't see how we can compromise on the little things and expect us to stand in that day where the big things really are on the line. Maybe there's a false dichotomy, the little and the big. I think it's a false dichotomy, that little white lie.
Question from Jay's Wing. Are you in Jay's Wing? Student life? Is there anybody?
We put our brother-sister wing together, and for some reason, I'm now in D2. But regardless, our question that both the guys and the girls came up with, just to be clear, are high and low telos history different ways of doing history, or merely different attitudes toward history? And how do they relate to other disciplines such as economics, sociology, psychology? Okay.
And is there a high and low telos sociology and economics? Okay, what a neat question. So I do think this has a lot to do with attitude, okay? We can use a word. I mean, worldview is a word that I use a lot. It's a word that encompasses quite a bit. But attitude is a lot of what I'm talking about here with high and low telos history. Because again, and I think Dr. McRoberts has a good point, we should never forget the power of admonition and learning from that. So I think this is high and low telos. The difference, a lot of it is attitude, number one. And attitude, perspective to look at, right? What are you looking at? Actually, perspective to look through, right? To look through all the mess, and what am I looking at? I'm looking at Jesus Christ, or just the problem, obsessed with the problem. And how does it relate to other disciplines? Economics, sociology, psychology. Well, I've already done a real number on a couple of those fields. I've already questioned their separation from history, put it that way, all right? And I think there are some fields out there that are not even legitimate fields of study, but I'm not going to say which ones. Is there a high and low telos sociology and economics? I was driving to work this morning thinking about journalism. Is there a high journalism and a low journalism? I'm sure there is. Part of this is truthfulness and storytelling, but then what is your end goal besides just Okay, I got the facts here. I was thinking about the news. You could always just do the news of the bad. It seems like the news is so full of trash. And maybe it's real events that are happening, but what about, and yeah, I guess, the kid who, saves the kitten out of the tree. That's not in the news very much. But, positive events, I think we've seen a shift away from that kind of positive storytelling. That might be wrong, but I do think there's a high and low telos way to do that. Something like geography, high geography, low geography. I don't know about that.
That's mountains and
right. Economics. I think Professor Russell's very good at looking behind the scenes, behind the graphs, and we're talking about people's time. We're talking about time, and time is representative of value in a lot of ways, right? People aren't just widget makers, and I think Professor Russell's very good at teaching that. So I do think there is a way to do those. Those are out of my lane. So,
does Patrick Henry College have a high telos or a low telos? Because I would think that we do both. I would think that there's plenty going on here about warning us about mistakes we could make. I also think we'd be really dissatisfied if that was our curriculum, right? Wednesday's U.S. history class, there's 3 things we don't do, right? So I would think that even as an institution, although we do have some low telos warning stuff, a lot of what we do is high telos, isn't it? Isn't it exhorting us to the good, the true, and the beautiful?
This reminds me of the difference between a philosophy in the 5th century by a guy named Siddhartha, you know him as Buddha, and a Greek guy, Antisthenes, had the same idea. This idea of don't do to others what you don't want done to you. It's a really low telos view, right? You don't really hurt anybody, but no one shows up at your funeral, okay? But Jesus Christ has the infinite bar, right? Do to others how you want to be treated. And I think that contrast is a good example between the two.
It may depend on the particular disposition of a culture, though, because I can imagine the negative the version of the golden rule that you stated does provide a kind of lower trajectory. But if it's being spoken into a culture where life is cheap and force is the prevalent kind of discourse, then it's really quite a remarkable improvement.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I just have a question, if I could. Yeah.
You're the moderator.
The Santayana take on history that you start with, that you're calling low telos view of history. Does anybody really subscribe to that? I mean, I'm thinking, and it's on page 20 where you're speaking in terms of some of the deformations of the 20th century, and you note that in terms of nationalism, there's a kind of eschatological tool that history is employed as. Putting the nation in eschatological terms and shaping a history in terms of the nation is certainly, it can be perverse, but it's not low. Right? That I wonder if our human aspirations and even the way that we see and approach the world makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to simply or to consistently apply the low telos Santayana account of history. Aren't we always going to be veering into this high telos version? And it's either going to be a more or less true account of history or one that is perverse and put to use by political power.
So your last question, I do agree we're going to do one or the other.
I'm wondering if it's possible to consistently do the low. That is going to be harnessed somehow. That human beings are, by nature, aspirational creatures, and we're going to either be aspiring toward something that is good, true, and beautiful, or alternatively, we're going to be pursuing pseudo versions of those things, perverse versions of those things that will end up into bloody, destructive messes. But nevertheless, we seem to be sort of set in that way.
So would this be something like, I mentioned this in my talk, how Marxist states tend to, first off, they start the calendar over. Day one of the calendar is a revolution. And they're perpetually there. 70 years in North Korea, we're still in the revolution. Of course, this lets you murder anybody you need. But are you saying that's kind of a disordering of loves? There's still, the previous history was just imperialist, and that, for them, that, or at least Kim Jong-un, that beforehand was ages past, and that was low. And now we're striving still to get there to a higher eschaton, and we can't not do it.
Well, if you look at the various uses of history in the Revolutionary Age, think the French Jacobins, think the Stalinists, and so on. They're all appealing to history, and they're all aspirational. They have a very high telos, if you will, but it's a perverse one. Mm-hmm. It's been twisted in such a way that it's going into harmful directions. But they're not simply saying, well, we just look at history in order to be warned against potential pitfalls. No, they turn religion or to history into a kind of religious impulse that is clearly aspirational.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, this has been happening since the garden, right? We're going to love and worship something. It's just Satan convinces us it's going to be ourselves. So I agree with that.
I think you're right that in practice, in real life, you don't see countries and leaders implementing low telos history. But at least at the church barbecues I go to, I hear it all the time. Right? And so I think that phrase, at least mine, I don't know what you were intending here. So
the church barbecue, yeah.
I thought the idea was just to say many people have very low expectations from history.
Yeah.
And we ought to have high expectations. Like the Marxists, who are wrong, but they certainly have high expectations for history. They have an eschatology out there.
Yeah.
Well, we've turned this high telos idea back into a relative concept, so I'm not happy with it. I mean, it can't just be relative. I mean, you can't really say, what is the end of Marxism? The end of Marxism. I mean, when you talk about telos, you're talking about ends, right? Mm-hmm. Not aspirations, ends. So, in fact, the end of communism is a communist utopia where, with everything that is engaged. He tells you what is ended. Now, that's a very low end. Because it has a wrong understanding of human nature. And it does, and it's assuming happiness in really, really narrow terms, which is purely economic, as though man is, his whole idea of man is homo faber. He makes man. So in fact, if we want to talk about true high teloses, they actually have to begin with a proper understanding of what man is, which raises all kinds of questions, So that's why I'm finding the language a little messy here.
Well, is it the language that's messy, or is it the people who are messy?
Well, the language, just in the particular discussion, because I didn't want to call Marxism having high telos. That was my problem. I mean, if you mean it's abstracted, it's theoretically complex, well, that's I thought, not what Dr. Favelo wanted to say high telos was. I thought he wanted to mean it was actually a true understanding of man.
If low telos is merely looking at history as a warning, that's not what Marx does.
That's not what Marx.
He's got a positive agenda, and if that's what we mean by high, that's maybe that's what we need to clarify.
That was more my problem, the language of high.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, to me, this is the problem with this idea of the ordering of loves. And when you sin, when you steal, you love, let's say you steal a loaf of bread, you love eating and continuing your existence. That's fine, that's good, but you just love that more than you love loving your neighbor. So it's somehow a distorted love. This always bothered me. Is that truly love?
It's disordered, right? I mean, we always pursue what we love. That's Augustine's point, and we can have well-ordered loves or disordered loves.
That's what I see here with this high-low with Marx. He's looking so high, but he's looking at A lie. Well, it rhymes too.
Must be true. Any follow-up?
Well, the whole problem, if it's a lie, then it's not a high, I mean, it can't be a good, and if it's a lie.
Well, it's a pseudo-good.
It's a pseudo-good. I mean, people can aspire for these very things that they think are high goods, but they aren't. And surely, therefore, the real problem is that one has to actually be able to say why Christianity, if it's going to present us with the true high telos, is true.
So I mentioned this in my paper that Christianity alone can explain, because the Marxist, all he has to back up his assertions, I think he would say, scientifically, it has been shown that from the sum total of history, it has been shown that we're on a projection to the big one, right? The elimination of the state. The problem is, if I had Mr. Marx here, I guess I would say, is that really the sum total of history? How did all these things that you say are happening like this? Is that all of the data? I'd say no. Look at this. You've got a man who rose from the dead, a historical event. This doesn't happen normally. Why would he do such a thing? And maybe there's an end that you can't see, and you have this kind of, well, this is not very nice to say to somebody, but a hubris about exactly knowing everything. You think your reason is completely infallible and can look at all the data perfectly. No, we see through a mirror dimly. So I think there'd have to be that redefinition, which actually was you're talking about, Dr. Baer. I think you'd have to give him a proper set of lenses, which with humility and grace.
Colonel Middleton's group. And next time we'll do a reminder, if you're the person, sit close to a mic. That would be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Favelo. Our question is, seeing that we are in this now and not yet stage of redemptive history, how do we confront largely negative events, such as the Holocaust or Civil War, with a high telos mindset that pursues and focuses on the true, the good, and the beautiful?
Well, it's a great question, because we are already not yet. So these horrible things happen, and there's a big debate. I don't know if we're going to get into it, this whole providentialist or academic Christian historian question. Is the bombing out of Germany, is that somehow God's judgment? Was the Civil War God's judgment? I know you all talk about this in Dr. Spinney's class, okay? But generally speaking, number one, we're going to tell that story truthfully. I mean, you know that there are Holocaust deniers, right? Let's step away from that topic. Something else. They're not really Civil War deniers, but in a sense, I mean, we had in the 1920s, 1930s. Dr. Spinney can check me on this, but guys like Charles Beard, who is arguing, you know what? It's basically it was a big war on economic principles, and that's not the whole story. And so, in a sense, that's a kind of Civil War denial, not the event itself, but of the purposes behind it. How many times, if you have a discussion, the Civil War is not about slavery? I'm like, well, it's about a lot of things, but it was about slavery to an extent, right? And we can add states' rights, of course. So that's a kind of denial. So we're going to tell a true story, and then second, I hope in our history books or teaching our kids or conversations, we remember that all of this fallen world, there is an end to the story. The redemption occurred, and the restoration is to come. And we tell that complete. Now, does that mean every single, like Cato, Carthago delenda est, right? He's giving a speech about fixing the sewers, and by the way, Carthage must be destroyed. Does your history book of small town hero Bob always have to end with, and remember, kids, Jesus is coming? I don't know that we do that, but we keep it in mind as we teach, okay, as we teach others and in our writing. It's just like people talk about this with art history. Does every painting need to have some kind of small Christian reference somewhere on the painting, or can it just be a still life of a bowl of pears? Yes, it could be a still life of a bowl of pears. But when you're talking with somebody about the beauty of that, the simplicity and value and et cetera, maybe that will lead to a conversation that talks about why those things are the way they are.
I'm sorry, I don't have the question in front of me. Was part of your question was part of your question, how do you get a high telos history out of something like the Holocaust?
Yes, sir. And why should we study it if our focus is supposed to be on the good?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, just one thing just comes to mind is, of course, the Holocaust is horrific. We can say that. The Holocaust, in many ways, launched the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States. Because here in the United States, people who were almost congenitally racist all their lives saw the Holocaust and said, "Oh my goodness, that's where racial discrimination goes. That's where the idea of racial inferiority goes. Oh dear." So right after World War II, this is the first time you see significant numbers of Americans kind of going, "Okay, wait. We got to rethink this whole issue here." So to me, maybe that's in part this high telos idea is that you can look at the Holocaust effect on other people, say Americans in the late 1940s, and see behavior we can emulate in that sense.
But isn't that the admonition of history? Look what happens if you follow this end. I call it admonition.
Yeah.
Is that low?
Is that therefore low? Yeah.
That's your.
Well, to me, it's there's the admonition. Don't go home and be a Nazi. Okay. But there's also.
You hear all that? That's just. Don't do that.
But there's also there's also something higher, and that is there are compelling reasons. There are compelling reasons to recognize the essential humanity of all people. Something like that.
And that's the positive sort of flip side of the admonition. So again, they seem to be pretty tightly related in important ways. This is Dr. Estep's group. Elizabeth Russell, I believe, is the reader.
All right, so are historical movies a way by which our culture's prevailing low telos view of history can be transformed into a high telos view? Or do they compromise veracity too much to be consistent with the high telos view that you proposed? And how would you reconcile the tension?
This reminds me, I told this story, I don't know, in some class. So there's this movie 300, right? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. There's movie 300 that is a retelling of a true story, right, at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians, no one ever remembers the 700 Thespians, they died there too for democracy. There's no 700 Thespians movie, right? So 20 years ago, this movie, actually based off of a comic book, was made, and it's got rhinos and orcs and all kinds of weird stuff. And obviously, there were no rhinos at Thermopylae. So the question is, did this distort the history, where it becomes, where it's no longer a real event? And I'm very skeptical of this is kind of the embellishment question we had earlier. I don't think it does justice. Now, a man who trained me, Dr. Victor Hansen, he was brought that movie before it was ever released. It was just had been filmed. The brothers who made that film, they brought it in handcuffs, right? Handcuffed, right, in the briefcase. And they showed it to him, and he said, "This is trash. This is not what happened. This is terrible." And then he had a thought. But, you know, this is kind of artistic creativity, and the Greeks are all about artistic creativity, and this could really get people excited about Greece, which it did, right? How many Spartan runs? I won't ask for a show of hands. How many of you had Molon Labe on the side of your bags, your gym bags, right? Everywhere. But is that pragmatism, right? You know, it's going, even if it's wrong, it's still going to get people excited about this great moment. I'm still skeptical. I don't think we should make these you tell this story, but then you have to throw the obligatory love story in the middle of the Battle of Stalingrad, okay? So I'm troubled by it. Does it help? I'm just answering your question with questions. There is a tension there. I'm troubled by distorting the truth and calling it nonfiction.
Dr. McRoberts' affection for superhero films is well known. Do superheroes represent a kind of heroic, aspirational type that not historic, but in a way mythical, that serves a kind of virtue-promoting role in our society today?
Oh, I thought it was for Dr. McRoberts. Oh.
He can answer.
You want to answer that?
You get first dibs.
Well, there are some side problems. We haven't brought up gender too much. One problem I have is people watch these movies and think that they're empowered because if that superwoman can climb up that wall, I must be able to also. And, I can go out there and I'm bothered by this. I think it's a distortion of reality. But, if I watch a Thor movie or a Spider-Man movie, am I enabled to live better? But they're just so unattainable. Whereas if I watch a movie like, what's a good example? Something like a good war movie here. I mean, Dirty Dozen. Am I going to be like, well, Telly Savalas murders somebody at the end? If I watch your standard war movie, World War II movie, you know what? I know my brother was a Marine. I fought in Iraq, so this could be us. This is something that I could do. I hope I would rise to that occasion, but I haven't actually watched any of the Thor movies, okay? Sorry, don't tar and feather me, but I don't really see myself aspiring to something because of that. That's my take. How about you, Dr. McRoberts?
Well, I mainly watch them because I like manly movies. And they have good language. They don't have bad language. Those are the main reasons I watch them. But I can see them as inspiring someone to something good, courage, things like that. Like I put them like Lord of the Rings. I loved Lord of the Rings because it inspired the most noble thoughts within me in terms of bravery, honor, etc. The willingness to die for his fellow hobbits or for his hobbits. I don't know. That's where I group these superhero films.
Yeah. Professor Leas.
Can I read a couple quotes in response?
Yeah, if they're short.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
So, the general Greek principle of history is a very good one. Put before your eyes and hearts examples of how to live rightly. All the time, live and breathe it, and eventually people will strive to live the same way. And avoiding all the pontification I want to give regarding superhero movies, line from Man of Steel, Jor-El, you will give the people of earth an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you, they will stumble, they will fall, but in time they will join you in the sun, Cal. In time you will help them accomplish wonders. He's obvious Christ's parallel in the case of Superman, but the language just jumped out at me a lot in the text of the talk. And there's no question here, it's just...
So, I'm not saying we should not have fiction. Does everybody hear me right on that, right? I mean, I read the Iliad for fun. But what bothers me is a movie like Alexander. So there really was an Alexander the Great, and he really did just amazing things. But then you get a movie like Alexander, this trash, that completely lies. It's totally wrong, and I think it destroys the lessons that can be learned from Alexander's life about the power of courage, for example. And so when the nonfiction becomes fiction, I think there's been a betrayal there.
Very good.
Actually, one question? Can it be given that God is in control of all history, and therefore God is going to speak most effectively through a true understanding of something than through something which has been shaped to our purposes? And that God will put examples or truth in such a way that it is more instructive, better for us if we get to the truth, and just trust that? And that's part of his created order, even in its fallenness?
This sounds like another faith and reason lecture. All right, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking the panel, and especially... And after seeing him in action, I can see why you all appreciate Dr. Favelo's classes so much. All right, you're blessed to have him. And Dr. Spinney is going to close us with prayer.
Father, we bow before you this afternoon, and we take our place before your throne as your creatures. And you are our creator. And we acknowledge that all that we have, our life, the next hour, it comes because you've given it to us. You provided these things. And Father, even as we have talked today about being exhorted to be better, to be more like the Lord Jesus Christ, to live more noble lives. I pray that you would do this in us, that would indeed be true of us, and not just so our lives would be more successful, not just that, but so that you might be more fully glorified, so that we might be more useful instruments in your hands. So Father, please work in us so that our lives are more like you want them to be, please. Father, we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.